Livestream show where we showcase amazing Australian women speakers, so you get to see the huge amount of talent available. And so we can shift the stats from 30% women speakers at events to 50%. Now, my guest today, joining me today, is the wonderful Dr. Jo Lukens. Hi, Jo. How are you today?
Very well, thank you, Rachel. Thanks for having me along.
You are very welcome. Thanks for coming. So just a quick introduction. Jo is a psychological Indiana Jones. I like that description. And Dr. Jo helps motivate teams and organisations develop high-performance thinking without the waffle. I really like that too. And in particular, you work with the Australian Defence Force as well.
I do. I'm very fortunate to work across a range of domains, including sport and our amazing Defence Force personnel and corporate settings. So lots of great areas where I find my messages are well appreciated.
Yes. And I can imagine that bringing, the history that you have, particularly, with your psychological background, you've got a PhD, you've been in the industry for over 30 years. People would be just so keen to hear from you and to gain wisdom from your experience.
Yeah, I really enjoy sharing some of the messages and some of the learnings. I think that's probably where a lot of my work's been, particularly in this last sort of 10 or 15 years, because obviously, if you look at sport, elite sport and defence as examples, ultimately the end game for both of those domains is very different. But the parallels between, anyone who's trying to perform at their best, and whether that be in work settings or sports settings, whether that be in our personal lives, whether it be in our families, there's lessons from high performance for everyone potentially. So I always say, you don't have to be an elite athlete to think like one. So it's just sharing and applying some of those lessons and just helping people pick up some handy hints along the way that they can maybe integrate into their lives, into their works, that helps them get to closer to whatever their goals are.
Yes, I like how you say that it's beyond the job description. It could be something that we can actually use for our personal lives. So how did you come to get into this area? What has fascinated you enough to make you work in this area with the high performers, I guess?
Yeah, well, you would want to be able to answer that and say, well, it was all part of a well-planned career path for myself. But the actual reality of that is it actually happened by accident.
Right.
And I've been around long enough, and maybe some of the listeners have, to remember a Gwyneth Paltrow movie from the 90s, which was Sliding Doors. And even if you don't remember Sliding Doors the first time around, essentially, that story of, you can turn left or turn right, and then all of a sudden your life is completely different. Yep. So I had a sliding doors moment when I was a very keen teenager who thought I was going to join the Queensland Police Force. So that's what I thought I was going to do with my career. And then at a police academy, when I was a school student, a police officer just randomly walked past me, and I don't think he pointed the finger, but I think the story's better if I say that. He pointed his finger at me and said, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "Oh, I'm coming to join the police force." And he said, "Well, what degree are you going to do?" And I said, "Oh, I don't know. I didn't think I had to," which you didn't have to, but well picked up by the police officer, because he said, "Well, I think you do." And I went, "Oh, so what do I do?" And he said, "Something to do with people. Good luck," and kept walking. And, fair play. I was 16 at the time, and I probably looked 12. So I went back to my school and I spoke to the guidance officer and said, apparently I need to do a people degree to join the police force. And so it was the 80s when you just did what you were told, and the guidance officer said, well, why don't you do psychology? And I said, well, that sounds like people. And I said, where do I go to do that? Because I grew up on the Sunshine Coast. Yep. And he looked up the QTAC book, which was the university admissions book. And whether he read it rightly or wrongly, he told me that I needed to go to James Cook University in Townsville, which was 1,200 kilometres away from my home. It turned out there were 5 universities within 100 kilometres of my home I could have gone to as well. But I went crazy anyway, turning it into a long story. But I came into it by accident. So I did a psychology degree, probably just as well for the good people of Queensland that I decided not to become a police officer. I do like rules, but I don't know if I would have been a great police officer. And so then my career, being based in North Queensland for the rugby league fans, the North Queensland Cowboys came to town in 1995. I started as their first ever sports psychologist in 1996, and it kind of took off from there. So did my PhD, as you mentioned, particularly in the sports environment. And then, like many people, what I always recommend to young graduates is if an opportunity comes along the way, think yes and work out how later. So I took on lots of opportunities early in my career, and now that I'm further along in my career, shall we say, I now have that opportunity to kind of weave through and work with where I think I can best share my messages. So I've spent 30 years in elite sport. I've worked in corporate settings. I've worked with school leaders. I particularly like working with school principals as well. And then obviously the work within the Defence Force. So now I find myself across the country sharing the messages of high performance.
Wow, that is an amazing story. I think it's just so pivotal, the sliding doors moment. I know I've had similar moments, and just how it can really, as you say, really define your life. It can put you on the path that you're meant to be on. And I guess that you must look back and go, this was the right path for me.
Yes, well, fortunately, I do think that. I don't know what the path might have been if I hadn't walked across, stumbled across that police officer back then, and I had, I'm sure I would have gone into a career in policing and loved it and thought I've absolutely landed. I have a message that I often share with the athletes that I work with is that, you're usually exactly where you need to be in any given moment. Even if you feel a bit worried, if you feel a bit anxious, you're where you're meant to be, that life, has set us up for whatever moment we're in. And we've usually got the skills to work ourselves through most things. But yes, I do at times wonder with those sliding doors moments. And I think that message resonates for lots of people. I love the thought of that, because I know that was a pivotal moment. But I wonder what the other pivotal moments that have been through my life, and other people might wonder the same, the things that you could never know what would have happened had you turned right or turned left, or you'd said yes to that opportunity instead of saying no, or, So I think, it's always been a curiosity for me, but it was very definitely a pivotal moment for me. Yeah. One, to have been guided into psychology, into university, and then being guided by my guidance officer to psychology, because I don't know in the 90s when I graduated if the opportunities would have been the same for me if I had done the same degree in a different location. So North Queensland has been a wonderful place for me to form my career and meet some great people along the way.
Oh, yes, the people. Meeting people along the way. You just never know who you're going to meet.
No. And elite sport, it's huge, but it's also a very small community. And then particularly, so I spend a lot of my time working within sort of rugby league, and also within the sports of basketball, track and field, and so forth. And once you start to find yourself in those circles, people know people and are connected. And so, you form relationships and you meet just some great people along the way. So I think that's been part of the joy of the journey for me.
Yes, and propels us forward, doesn't it?
It does indeed.
Yes. So we already know that you've worked heavily with the Australian Defence Force and elite sport performers. Is there any other kind of audience that you have enjoyed working with, or have also benefited from your training?
So I think predominantly the audiences I work with are generally people who are curious about, tell me something new that I can apply in my own life. So I think, and to your point before about our working lives versus other parts of our lives, that's a core message that I have. Say, if I'm working with an athlete and they, I mentioned rugby league. So a rugby league game at the elite level will typically go, in the men's game, it will go for 80 minutes. In the women's game, it'll go for 70 minutes. So 70, 80 minutes. Yeah. And you want to perform at your best in those 70 or 80 minutes. Well, you could just try and apply your psychological skills, say your mental skills, your physical skills in that window of time. Or what about if you applied some of those skills outside of your playing time, outside of your performance? Because we actually spend a lot more time outside of sport than we spend in it, even for the elite athletes. So, if you want to, if I give a micro example, if an athlete wants to be able to build their skills in choosing when to react in situations versus responding in situations, which is a common thing for most of us, whether we be driving through the traffic, someone cuts in front of us, you can react or you can respond, so life presents us with lots of opportunities there. But if you want to be able to do it in a high pressure moment, in a grand final, in the closing minutes, and something, a referee makes a call you don't like, and you know you want to respond in that situation rather than react,
Yep.
please don't expect that in the closing minutes of a grand final, you're suddenly going to whip that skill out of your back pocket and go, that's right, Joe told me about that 3 months ago. So, my message to athletes is always about, well, practice it as much as you can. Practice it in the places you feel safe.
Yep.
Use respond and react in your home situations, because when you build the skill and you build the capacity, then in the pointy end of life, whether it be that boardroom negotiation, or whether it be that you're standing on stage, or whatever it is that you might be doing, or our defence members are in all sorts of situations where they need to navigate, say, when to respond, when to react. We can use those other times of our lives to apply it. So broadly, what I would say is the audiences I find myself in front of are quite diverse. So, I'll work in corporate settings. I might work within medical teams, or I might work within government agencies. But generally, the common element between everyone who is sitting in a seat on the other side of me is generally someone who is just curious about what's something you can share with me that I can apply to my life. So I think that's what I've probably really tried really hard to do through my messaging, is go, how can I cut through everything that I know and make it relatable for you sitting in the seat, that you can then not just go, well, that was interesting, that was a nice way to spend 45 minutes listening to her, but you can actually take some little gems out of there. I'm always saying that success leaves clues. So how can you pick up some of the clues and then apply it in your own life when you walk out of the presentation?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think because I'm a teacher, and I'm always looking for ways for the people that I work with to implement what I'm teaching throughout their day, rather than just in that little small space of time that they spend with me. And I can imagine that there are so many things that you can take away from training with the high end athletes that you work with, but there are just so many life lessons in there, and so many opportunities to develop, I guess, new brain pathways in terms of how we respond and how we behave and how we want to be in society in general. And there's just so much there. My brain is exploding of possibilities as you're talking. But what would be, you've already mentioned that, reacting or responding is something that you talk about. Are there any other aspects that when you're working with athletes that we can apply to our everyday life?
Yes, certainly, because I think the reason it's so relatable for us is, first of all, within our Australian communities, typically many people love sport or an aspect of sport. I know not everybody does, but the sporting themes make sense to people, and I've even found that in audiences when people have gone, look, I'm not really a sports lover, but I can see how this works. Or they might be a musician, or they might be a performer, so wherever we're trying to do our best, you might be I had some school students that I work with. I don't work with younger school students so much, but I sometimes work at that grade 11, grade 12 space, and I work with some students who were going to World Robotic Championships, So again, it's, that's very different to tackling the footy field, but the principles are the same. And so I guess there's a lot of curiosity that people have about, what is translatable from sport. And particularly I find there's a lot of people who are really interested and curious about what are some of those key predictors of high performance. And some of the things might surprise people a little more than you would expect. I was talking with an audience yesterday, and I said, I'd really love to come in and say to you that the key predictors of high performance are all these really secret squirrel kind of psychology concepts that only I know about and only I can teach you. And look, there's no doubt there's some bright and shiny stuff that you can do, but it's actually some of the foundational things that people actually know about themselves. Like if I came into an audience and said, well, before you do anything else, let's start off with a good night's sleep. Let's hydrate. Let's have some good fuel in our bodies, and doing some physical activity through the week. People would probably sit there and go, not really surprised to hear that. And why did we get a speaker in that was going to tell us those are the things? Well, those are the things because they are your absolute foundational key elements. That try doing anything when in reverse. Try doing anything when you're tired. Try doing anything when you're hungry. When your body feels yuck. So the interesting thing though that I find, Rachel, is that people know it, And then you go, well, how's it going for you? You know, like most people probably listening to us would go, yeah, I know that sleep is a performance enhancer, and I know that fuel's good for me, and I know I need to go for a walk or go to the gym or whatever it is. We know this stuff. But then at the end of the day, when we're making decisions like, do I go to bed or do I press next episode on my streaming channel? You know, and then people go, oh, I'm so weak. Well, you're not weak. You know what you are? You're tired. You know, so the challenge is that we're not always going to feel motivated. So we need to have discipline.
Yeah.
We're not always going to be disciplined. So we need to rely on our habits. You know, we always, when we're tired and fatigued, we fall to our habits. You know, it's a message that we know. And one of the things that people are often interested in is, well, how do you create a new habit? You know, if I know I want to be going to bed half an hour earlier, how do I go from saying it, you know, we're speaking to each other before lunch, so we're in kind of the peak hour of the morning. You know, and that sounds like a great idea now, but, you know, if I'm snoozing on my couch at 9 o'clock tonight and I go, well, that, you know what I've got to do? I've got to turn the lights off and I've got to put the cat out, I've got to shut the door and I've got to brush my teeth. And it's actually easier to lie on the couch. So we defer to the easier option, not because we're weak, but just because we're tired and fatigued. And also maybe it's not the habit. So we have lots of conversations in some of the presentations that I give and some of the workshops that I deliver around how do you take a good intention and then turn it into an actual behaviour that you can do consistently. So it's talking about some of those things.
That makes a lot of sense. A lot of sense. And I think you tapped into something really interesting there, or very critical, is all the steps that we have in place that we have to do before we get to bed. And and just the little decisions that we make influenced by what's ahead of us, and it can often be very reactionary, I would imagine.
Yes. Yeah, which is where that react and respond concept that we talked about before, that can have an interplay. Because, you know, I guess probably one last point on the habits that I'd say, you know, habits are great because they save us from having to think. But habits can be terrible because they save us from having to think, you know. So depending on what our habits are, they can work well for us or they can work against us. And so that's why having some tools and some skills and some understanding around it, you know, you get those things in place with habits, then you can start to look at some of the other elements of high performance that sit around curiosity and gratitude and mindset and who's in your corner and how do you then adapt from when a disappointment comes along. You know, like all of those elements become critical as well. But gee, they're so much easier when you're looking through the lens of, you know, having had some decent sleep and so forth. So the good thing is there's strategies and there's tips and tricks that you can do then that helps get you closer to those elements and gets you closer then by default to high performance.
Yeah. Wow, I can just sit here and listen to you talk all day, Jo. But another question that I have for you is, you probably didn't start your career presenting. You were working with one-to-one clients. How did you make the transition from one-to-one clients to presenting? What sort of got you into the presentation ballgame?
Into that. So again, back to my point earlier, I said yes when opportunities came along, even when, you know that moment when you go, bite off more than you can chew and then just chew hard. So I was fortunate too, though, early in my career that in addition, so I did do 29 years of sort of psychological counselling, you know, for what people might know that profession to be. My client base was more typically those who were, you know, working in the area that we would call positive psychology, the science of what goes well. So people would typically come to me because they were functioning fairly well in what they were doing, but they wanted to get that little bit higher in what they're doing. They knew that they could do more than they were achieving, and they just wanted a bit of a hand and someone to kind of coach and mentor and counsel them through that. In terms of the presenting, that first started for me not long after I graduated. So I also secured an academic position at James Cook University. So I started off, back then we were called tutors. Now they're called associate lecturers. And so that was a really great grounding for me to learn to communicate messages with others, you know, and it holds true to everything that I say to the players that I work with now, to the defence members I work with, anyone really. You know, if I teach you a skill around, say, responding and reacting, I'll stick with that as the example, then the best way for you to ingrain it for yourself is to teach it to somebody else. And you would know that, Rachel, with your teaching background as well. So that's always been a common theme for me. So I still have an academic position at JCU. So I'm now an associate professor there. So I spent several decades teaching students and then lecturing students as well. And I think some of the things that helped with that is that within the psychology degree, there's obviously a whole range of subjects. The one subject I said to the head of school when I first started teaching, I think it was my second year out, I taught first year psych the first year, which was good because I was about 3 years older than the students. So I didn't want to be teaching students that were significantly older than me. I thought I was feeling a little bit anxious about that. But then in my second year, the head of school said to me, "Jo, what would you like to teach next year?" And I said, "Well, can I please stay with the subject I've been in, because I've kind of got my training wheels on and I know what I'm doing there. And look, I don't mind, Prof, I'll teach anything, just maybe not research design and statistics," because I'd struggled with it as a student and I'd failed it in high school. So I failed maths in high school. I did maths 1 back in the day and I failed it. So my confidence was not high in that area. So I don't know how it came about, but 2 months later, the teaching schedule came out and there I was teaching research design and statistics. So I was literally 48 hours in front of the students for every lecture. But the point of sharing that is I was sharing information in an area where I didn't feel confident, where I felt vulnerable, and I knew what it was like to struggle in that area. So I think that really helped me to distill the messages in my head. As I know I had 200 students in the class, and I know that I had students that were far brighter than me in that particular area. But I thought my job here is actually to teach everyone in this room. So I need to be able to go, "Hey, listen, here's this concept. I know it's got lots of big words in it and it sounds a bit convoluted, but let's distill it down to what it is." And I think that's what I've held on to throughout my career. And you said it in my introduction. We can make things sound very clever and complicated, but if we do that, it takes a lot of brain power to process it. So I would rather make it simple enough that people go, "Okay, I get that," because then they can use all their brain power, their valuable brain power, for applying it to their own lives. So I'm a big fan of simplifying, not oversimplifying messages, but simplifying messages down that you go, "Look, this is the essence. This is how a habit works. This is what you need to do when you change it from here to here. Now, what questions do you have?" So when you do that, I think that becomes very relatable for people. Stories are relatable for people. So my job isn't to make it complicated. If I want to make it complicated, I'll go and write an academic paper. But that's not the majority of people that I'm speaking with on a day-to-day basis that are going to be that audience. So meeting the audience where they are, I guess, is the key thing there.
Oh yeah, and I mean, fate stepped in and said, "This is the lesson that you have to learn right now," and we're often not ready for those lessons, are we? We don't feel that we're ready, and then all of a sudden we're rising above and getting something from it, and it's like not as scary as I thought it was going to be.
No, the anticipation is often worse, isn't it?
It is, yes. I like that. And the whole concept of distilling a message, because, we want to know what to focus on. And there are so many things grabbing our attention that it is so appreciated when someone comes along and says, "You know what, don't worry about that. Don't worry about that. Let's just focus on these few things and let's just deal with that." And, they often say, let's actually talk to people as if we're talking to a 9-year-old and we're having to explain a concept. You wouldn't go into a huge convoluted description. It's about those few little things that are absolutely essential. And it's amazing what we can arrive at when we have to distill something right down.
Yeah.
So
and sometimes I think, I don't know if you find it, Rachel, but sometimes I find explaining something in a simple way is actually sometimes trickier than using all the psychology jargon words and throwing it out there and making myself sound very clever. So sometimes it takes a lot of thought. I found that I wrote a book in 2019 and it was like, how do I share some of the lessons? And it was like, well, you share them simply. That's what it is. You don't make it complicated. And it really was it was good for me professionally to go, oh, okay, so if I'm going to explain this to someone that it just is, it's crystal clear, it makes sense, all those sorts of things, what do I want to say? So it really does challenge you then to explain it in a way that's relatable and conversational and people, it's going to resonate for people. And more importantly, that they can use. That's what you ultimately want.
Yeah. So I'm guessing that, you know, a lot of people when they get up and speak, they are in some sort of teaching mode, because we're imparting information and, you know, we're hoping people are going to be digesting that information and learning something from it. Is there any advice that you would give to anyone listening right now who perhaps they're considering getting into presenting for the very first time, or they've been struggling? Is there any advice that you can pass on in terms of how to be authentic, how to do this gig in a way that brings you joy and satisfaction and all the right things?
Yeah, great question. So a practical, I've got two answers for that now that you've posed that to me. So a practical one is that often you have slides and so forth to accompany you when you're on a stage or when you're presenting. So my experience has been and I love watching other speakers too, because there's so much to be gained by watching others. You'll either, you'll pick up a turn of phrase, or you'll see how something gets presented, or sometimes you'll see how a message is delivered, and whether you think it's worked or it hasn't, you go, oh, that's not how I wanted to. So it helps you to define who you are as a speaker. So I think that's helpful. What's been helpful for me has been to make sure that my slides are very visual and to limit the text. So if there's 10 words of text on a slide that I'm presenting, then I go back and have another good long hard look at it. Now, I know some people like to give lots of text, but I find if you're throwing text up on the slide and you're talking over the top of it and the person's trying to comprehend it, that can be a lot. So I may sometimes supply notes as well, or a book or something like that. But so I do like simple slides. I do like pictures. There's some good evidence base that shows how well people respond to images in terms of memory and remembering things later. So that would be my very practical point. My other point, particularly for new speakers, is fantastic. We need more speakers, so there's enough for everyone to do. There's audiences out there that want to hear what people have to say. One of the biggest challenges I find that people talk to me about, and I talk a lot in author communities because that's where I spend a lot of my time, is people talk about this notion of imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
And it's not an unfamiliar one. And you have a room of people, like 100 people in a room, and you say, how many people have had or experienced imposter syndrome, and 80 hands go up, and then there's always one brave soul in there who goes, what's that? I've never heard of it. And everyone goes, oh, instant daggers towards that person who's never heard of it. If I can share one quick thought around that, is that sitting up in my cupboard behind me, there's one of my manuals back from my psychology days. It's a book called the DSM, and the DSM is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It's not a recommended read for anyone for light reading, because it's one of those books that you read through it and you suddenly decide that you've got 300 different conditions that you need to deal with, because it's like reading a medical text. Well, it is a medical textbook. The point of it is that notion of imposter syndrome, if I was to be able to hand a book through the screen to anyone who's listening now and said to you, go to the back of the index and look up imposter syndrome for me and tell me what the condition is, you would struggle because it's not there. So the label of imposter syndrome, the notion of imposter syndrome, the syndrome of imposter syndrome does not exist. There is no thing that is recognised in the psychiatric and psychological community. It's not a diagnosable condition. So the very good news for anyone who's listening to us in our conversation is you don't have it. You don't have it because it doesn't exist. Now, invariably, when I say that to an audience, I say, you don't have imposter syndrome. It's, and I talk about why you don't want to give yourself a syndrome that you don't have. I can see people looking at me and they're like, well, call it what you like, lady, but I don't know what's going on in my head, but it feels a lot like a syndrome. So that's where I make the distinction, is that nobody has imposter syndrome. However, there are times when anyone at different moments might have imposter thinking. That notion of, the notion of, am I up for this? Is this out of my skill set? Has someone accidentally invited me to do this when, gee, they mucked that up? That is That's very real. That's very real. And we all have those moments. I gave a presentation last year where I took a very deep breath before I walked in front of the audience, because I'm like, gee, let's see how this goes.
Yeah.
So because I, because of the respect I held for the audience, and anyway, I got through it. It all went really well. But so that imposter thinking is very, very real. Now what we want to do is we want to lean into that rather than go, oh, I feel like an imposter, I don't want to do it. Lean into it, because what imposter thinking offers you is a moment of doubt.
Yep.
And doubt is very helpful. So I am in Townsville today. So doubt stops me from driving across town, going into the Townsville hospital, gowning up and going, can I perform heart surgery? I should have a lot of doubt around that, because don't let me anywhere near a scalpel. I would be an imposter in that case. So imposter thinking raises doubt for us.
Yep.
Imposter thinking is transient. It can change.
Yep.
And we can listen to the doubt, but then what we do is become curious about that. Like, what made me think that I'm not equipped to do it, or someone's going to call me out, or I'm out of my depth, or whatever, and then go back to the evidence, because just because we think something doesn't mean that it's true. So just because we think it doesn't mean that it's true. So that's my two things for any aspiring speakers, to go very simple with your slides, because my experience is the audience appreciate the images and simple messages and the clarified messages. And the other thing is that if you have doubt for yourself, then that is a normal part of speaking. I 30 years in, and last year I gave a presentation where I did feel a little bit nervous about it, and you can work your way through that, but it's worth it to get up there and try.
Yeah. The concept of just get in there and do it, feel the fear and do it anyway, because I'm guessing you're likely to land on your feet, or you're likely to have a positive experience if you do lean into it.
There'll always be, with every experience that we do, success leaves clues. So if you give a presentation and it goes well, spend some time reflecting on why did it go well. And if there's elements of your speech that you go, oh, that bit really kind of, the energy dropped, or I don't know if I got my message across the way I wanted it to, or whatever, there's lessons there. Learn the lesson, be curious about that, and go, well, how could I do that differently next time? Let me get some feedback, and someone might say to you, well, you didn't look nervous, so, you can get that feedback. So there's always a lesson to be learned in everything that we do. And that's one of the things that we take from elite sport. On this weekend, sporting teams will play, some teams will win, some teams will lose. Those that win want to take some of the successes and the clues out of that. Those that lose need to learn the lessons so that they can come back again the next week and try and build towards more success the next week.
Yeah. There is a lot of crossover into life lessons there as well.
There is.
Yeah. Yes. Well, thank you so much for sharing all of that, because I think, someone with your career and your experience has just so much to share, and you would have so many memories across that time. Is there a standout experience for you on a stage that comes to mind?
Two. So the personal one for me was about 3 years ago. I was actually invited back by my alma mater, my university, to speak at graduation. I think it was 2,000 students graduating. And what I would say to those listening is, rather than talk about my experience of it, it's a really curious question. Well, it's an honour to be asked, but it's a really curious question to have someone say to you, you've got 12 minutes to speak to the 21-year-old version of yourself, basically. What do you want to tell them? You've got 12 minutes. Like, what does that speech look like? So I gave that presentation. So that was a really, I was honoured to do that, but it was really lovely to feel that I could share some messages with those graduating students. Yeah. And then my other really favourite moment on a stage, it wasn't actually me on the stage, but one of the teams I work with is the Papua New Guinea Orchids, which is the Women's National Rugby League team from PNG. And I've worked with them since 2022. We went to the World Cup and had an incredible time there, 6 weeks there. And for many of our players, had come from the Highlands of PNG, had never left Port Moresby, let alone, and did I mention that the World Cup was in England in the middle of winter? So, and I went there as the high performance psychology coach and the wellbeing manager. So there was plenty for me to do with that incredible group. one of the things we did on that campaign is we worked on the team values, and that's something that I'm often asked to speak about, is about how can you have value-aligned behaviour in an organisation or a team. So I often speak to that topic. So we had lived and breathed the values for those 6 weeks. We lived and breathed them in the next campaign a year later for the Pacific Championships. And it was at that moment on a stage in a little primary school in Port Moresby, our players went onto the stage, and the intention was that they were to talk about, you know, what are some things that orchids think that you children, because these were young primary school children, and they were meant to share messages of, you know, drink lots of water each day, do some sport. So they were the intended messages. And one of our players stood on the stage, and she talked to the she talked to the children about orchids' values. And if you want to be like an orchid, these are our values, and these are the things that you can do at school. And so it was kind of a conversation that had started with our conversations about values that I'd facilitated and been a part of, but to see someone else speak to what we had shared and what we had experienced, and the thought that that could go through, particularly the PNG community, which is a community that obviously the more support we can provide there, and particularly as female ambassadors in the sport as well. It was just, yeah, it's something I'll hold on to forever. And I must say, I'm sure it was dusty that day in Port Moresby because I was a little bit on the back of the room. There was so much pride and hamamas, which is gratitude with joy for that particular moment of sharing with those students.
Yes. And to know that you've impacted those lives in such a positive way.
Yeah, it was lovely to have had a small part in helping those players facilitate that for the students. It was just, it was a really lovely moment on stage, and I really appreciate being able to be part of that.
Yeah, congratulations. Yeah, as you say, you'll hold on to that forever.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, we need to I guess draw things to a close. But one thing that I would love our listeners to know is if anyone wants to book you, how can they get in contact with you, Jo?
Sure, thank you. Well, the very easy thing with all of my social media platforms is, as long as you know my name, you'll find me. So I'm on LinkedIn, but I've got a website with a contact form there, which will get you through to my email address, which will come through to me. So would love the opportunity. And even if people are curious about, what might be the topics and how might they particularly be applicable for their own audience, really happy, because I do have some key topics that are quite popular, but I'll always curate that in a way that is, particular to an organisation or around the themes or the intent, if it's a conference or something that you're looking for. So thank you for that. So yes, just find me on LinkedIn or anywhere else, and you'll be able to get in contact with me. And would love to hear from any of the listeners and any feedback on today's presentation or conversation. Today it wasn't presentation, conversation.
Conversation, yes. So thank you so much for joining us today. It has been an absolute delight chatting with you, Jo. And like I said earlier, I could just sit here and listen to you all day. You have so much wisdom to impart, so much great experiences that I'm sure that anyone listening, will go away just feeling very inspired. And I'm sure that, people are welcome to reach out to you to ask you more about what you do, as you say, through LinkedIn or through your website. And so to all our listeners, I hope you have enjoyed this interview. This interview goes live every Thursday at 11 a.m. Melbourne time on YouTube, and will be uploaded straight to LinkedIn and Facebook afterwards. If you do need a speaker, then please go to womenspeakers.com.au, and you don't have to pay a commission. You can contact your preferred speaker directly, and you can search by topic and location. You are also welcome to post a request into our Facebook and LinkedIn groups called Australian Women Speakers. And if you are a speaker or want to be, sign up to our directory and get found. But for now, I'm Rachel Pietsch. It has been a pleasure being with you today, and have a wonderful day.